My sole task is to not to introduce our distinguished speaker, but to introduce our distinguished introducer to our distinguished speaker. Yes. He's a person to whom the Church in the 21st Century Center owes a lot. He's been on our advisory committee and our steering committee, and is one of the people who's contributed most to this 8-year effort, not only in terms of his ideas, his contacts, but also he's always willing to do whatever you ask him, so he's been involved in a lot of our programs. It's Dr. Tom Groom, the chairperson of the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry department in the School of Theology and Ministry. Tom.
Thank you, Bob. And it's my pleasure to introduce a good friend and someone whom I consider to be one of the finest Catholic theologians, certainly in the United States today, if not in the world. And I say that without Irish blarney, of which I am totally incapable. It is a genuine assessment of this great man and his stature as a Catholic theologian. Professor Richard Gallardi began his career after college, went off, as many of you have, into an immersion experience in Mexico and spent a couple of years there. And I think a lot of his conviction and commitment and conversion, I suppose, both to academic life and to the pastoral life of the church in the world, I often think goes back to that experience, that immersion experience in Mexico. He came back and did a master's degree in biblical studies at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. Then he went on for masters in theology and systematics, and then a PhD in systematics at the University of Notre Dame. But there's no accounting for taste, and so we will not hold that against him. After that, he got gainful employment at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, for about 8 or 10 years, and then was appointed to a fascinating position. It's a chair of Catholic studies at the University of Toledo, Ohio, a great public university, and here with a chair of Catholic studies, the Murray and Basic Chair of Catholic Studies. And he's held that for the past 10 years and has done tremendous work out of that context within a great public university. And I've been there to do some little work myself, and I was just tremendously inspired by the kind of presence of Catholic studies that he has maintained at this great University of Toledo. However, the best is yet to come, because come this summer, himself and Diana, his beloved spouse, and his 4 boys, 2 twin boys, and 2 other boys, 4 sons, will pack up and move all the way to Boston and will become the new Joseph Chair of Theology at Boston College. So in a sense, this evening is just an aperitif. It's just a kind of an appetizer of what is to come from this great man. I have come to appreciate him deeply over the years because I was as likely to find him giving a keynote address at the Catholic Theological Society of America as giving a workshop at the Los Angeles Religious Education Conference. And I've met him in both places. And he's one of the few great theological minds that also has this ability to go out into the life of the church and be a tremendous resource at a pastoral level, and has a deep commitment and appreciation of the ongoing pastoral life of the church. All of our theologians intend as much, but not all of us pull it off with the same aplomb and the same effectiveness that Rick Gallardi does. And so he's got this tremendous commitment and has served in all kinds of United States Conference of Catholic Bishops committees and so on, and ecumenical dialogue and so forth. He has 7 published books, a collection of essays. It's just an outstanding theologian. Years ago, Dick McBrien, who was one of his advisors at Notre Dame and was one of my advisors here at Boston College, alerted me to Rick Gallardi, and then we began inviting him to the distinguished faculty of our Summer Institute here at Boston College, and he has come at least 9 or 10 summers now to teach core courses for us in our Summer Institute, and indeed will be here this summer and the summer after, and hopefully the summer after as well. So years ago, when I was starting out my own theological studies, I was in an Irish seminary college, and one of my professors, Father Larry Ryan, wrote his doctoral dissertation in 1960 on the priesthood of all believers. And Lar Ryan's dissertation at Maynooth College in Ireland was rejected on the grounds that it was a Lutheran idea. And it was too Protestant. And of course, I suppose Luther is one of the great mentors of the idea, indeed finding it in the early documents of the church, with this priesthood of all believers. Well, then about 3 years later, Lar Ryan got rehabilitated because the documents of Vatican II began to appear, and making statements that our baptism calls us to indeed participate fully in the priestly, prophetic, and kingly function of Jesus Christ, and that there is nobody any more baptized than anybody else in our church, and that gives us profound rights and responsibilities as a laity. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, some 45 years later, tonight's topic is probably still a worthy one. Does Vatican II's theology of the laity have a future? And there's nobody better to talk about it than Professor Rick Ghilardi. Please welcome him.
Well, good afternoon. It is absolutely impossible to live up to that introduction, so I'm just going to trust that those of you who know Tom know that he is capable of Irish blarney, and you take it with a grain of salt. I am delighted to have the opportunity to address this topic. Does Vatican II's theology of the laity have a future? The answer to the question is, it depends on what theology you're talking about. All right? I want to suggest over the course of my presentation that there is some legitimate disagreement about the Council's theology of the laity, and in fact I would argue that it's not just a question of interpretation. There is some ambiguity in the Council documents themselves regarding the theology of the laity. There are, in fact, I believe, two different theological approaches or trajectories or interpretive traditions on the laity that both sit kind of uneasily side by side in the Council documents. And that explains a great deal of sort of the ambiguity that we experience in the church even today, some 45, almost 50 years removed from the Second Vatican Council. So I want to talk about that theology in a little bit more detail. I want to suggest that we continue to be handcuffed by terminology, frankly, that I'm not sure continues to serve us well, including the very language of lay and clergy, which has continued, I think, to create many of the problems or perpetuate many of the difficulties that we experience today. To sort of tease that out in a practical level, I'd like to give you what I would call a tale of two ministries. I want to talk about two ordinary ministers serving the Catholic Church today faithfully. The first would be Deacon Javier Perez, who is serving as a permanent deacon in the Diocese of Brownsville. He is an ordained deacon who made a promise of obedience to his bishop at his ordination. He is subject to the pastoral assignment because of that promise of obedience. He's obliged to go where his bishop would send him on whatever pastoral mission his bishop deems appropriate. He is married, but if his wife dies, he will be compelled to live a life of celibacy unless he obtains a dispensation from church law. He is, by church law, a cleric, but he's married. He has 3 children. 2 are off to college, one's still at home, and he owns a petroleum engineering consultancy. So he is, by canon law, a cleric, right? But one who is in many other ways thoroughly immersed in what we would call the world, the ordinary life of Christians. Second person would be Ms. Mary Como, a parish pastoral associate, laywoman, has married children who are now grown. She has an advanced degree in pastoral ministry, a degree that she obtained at a school in which she took her theology courses, sitting side by side with seminarians pursuing ordained ministry. She works full-time in the church and is now dedicated, really, as much as she can tell, the rest of her life to ministering in service of the church. Yet she is canonically a layperson. Now the difficulty is when we look at these two people, they are not exceptional vocations in the church. The deacon is not married by dispensation. This is not the situation that we would have with a priest who was married, a minister in another Christian tradition converts to Catholicism and by dispensation is allowed to be ordained. No, this is part of the ordinary ministry of the church that we have this deacon. In the same way, Mary works full-time in the church, not by dispensation. She is a lay ecclesial minister and in fact plays a significant, one would say, indispensable role in the life of her parish. So these are ordinary ministers in the church. But if we look at their characteristics, we see that they significantly muddy the very coherence of the language of lay and clergy. All right? So it begs the question, well, what are we to do with this lay clergy language? According to the 1917 Code of Canon Law, in Canon 107, the lay clergy distinction is a distinction that exists by divine institution in the life of the church. But if we go back and look at the early church, we find very little evidence of the lay clergy distinction. The word kleros in its various cognate forms does appear in the New Testament, but never in reference to public ministers in the church. And the word laikos doesn't appear anywhere in the New Testament. Its first appearance in non-canonical literature is found in First Epistle of Clement, dated somewhere around 90, 100. The use of the term is disputed by scholars. It shows up again, I believe, around 180 in another source. It really doesn't become commonly used in the life of the church until the 3rd century. Well into the 3rd century. Now, this is not to say that the church of the 2nd century doesn't recognize a distinction between people who engage in public ministry in the church and those who do not. We find some plurality of terminology, but we find some terminological references to those who are involved in public ministry versus those who are not in the works of people like Justin Martyr and Tertullian. But there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that those terminological distinctions, for example, when Tertullian will speak of the plebs, the whole people, and those called to a public ordo, that Tertullian or anyone else has in mind two different states of life, or two different classes or categories of Christians. All right? Rather, what we're talking about are distinctions within an ecclesiology that is still grounded in what Jerry Austin calls the first ecclesiology of the Christian church, namely a theology of baptism. All right? It's only in the 3rd century that we begin to see the emergence of growing prominence of the distinction between laity and clergy. It's a distinction that will continue to harden over much of the first millennium. And though I can't do justice to what is a very complicated topic, I would highlight very briefly and schematically 4 factors that I think contribute to the progressive hardening of the lay clergy distinction over the course of the first millennium. So what we're talking about here is how do we get to this gradual emergence of the idea that there are two different kinds of Christians in the church? All right? The first begins to take place, I think, in the 3rd century, where from the 3rd through the 5th century we see a gradual reduction of ministry to ordained ministries in the church. That is to say, as best as we can tell, in the church of the first several centuries, there was a great diversity of ministerial forms and structures. There was a coalescence of certain forms of leadership structures around the deacon, the presbyter, and the bishop in the middle of the 2nd century, but those were by no means the only ministries in the church. There's a great diversity of Christians engaged in ministries, or we might say exercising the charisms that they believed that they had received by baptism. But beginning in the 3rd century, we start to see a reduction of ministry, more and more focusing first on the deacon and then later on the presbyter in the life of the local church. At the same time, in the 3rd century, we begin to see what we might call the sacerdotalization of ordained ministry in the church. There's a long and ancient tradition of Christians using the language of sacrifice to speak of their public worship. But for the most part, the language of sacrifice is metaphorical and doesn't presuppose a developed systematic theology of sacrifice, certainly in the first few centuries. There seems to be part of the reason for that, I suspect, is that early Christianity was bending over backwards to avoid kind of associating itself with Jewish understandings of law and priesthood and sacrifice. But in the 3rd century, Christianity sort of loses that bashfulness about appropriating those terms. And we see in, somebody like Cyprian of Carthage in the middle of the 3rd century, a claim that the Eucharist is a kind of continuation of the Jewish ritual sacrifice, albeit with significant Christian modifications and a dramatically different Christian theological understanding. But with that growing reappropriation of sacrificial language comes a tendency to look back for biblical motifs for ministry and looking to the Levitical priesthood. And so we begin to see a critical appropriation of, for example, the purity laws associated with the Levitical priesthood and the offering of sacrifice. That becomes more and more common in the 3rd and particularly 4th and 5th centuries. This, again, particularly when we see accompanying these the ritual purity laws and the application of those to those who preside over the church's worship, calls for sexual abstinence. And after sexual abstinence doesn't seem to be very successful because it's kind of hard to police that sort of thing, calls for clerical celibacy. And I don't want to suggest this is the only theology of clerical celibacy by any means, but it's certainly one strand of development in the tradition. But in any event, my point is that the sacerdotalization of ordained ministry, the use of the language of sacrifice, priesthood, cult, ritual purity, serves to harden the distinction between those who are ordained to presiding over public worship of the church and those who are not. Third, we would speak of the growing influence of Greco-Roman class distinctions. Keenan Osborne has talked about what happens, particularly after the Edict of Milan in the 4th century, when the church engages in a more positive and constructive engagement with Greco-Roman culture. Part of what happens is it encounters a Roman society divided into different ordines or orders. So you've got the Ordo Senatorius and the Ordo Equester, and it becomes natural for these class distinctions found in Greco-Roman society to be kind of imported into the life of the church and applied to the diversity of ministerial ordines that exist in the church. And the final factor would be the impact of monasticism. As you all know, monasticism arises in the 4th and 5th centuries, initially, of course, as a lay movement, right? As those who feel the need to react to the increasing worldliness of the Greco-Roman society and also Christianity after Constantine. Thomas Merton, in one of his collection on the writings of the Desert Fathers, kind of describes the dominant attitude of the early monastic figures. He writes, society was regarded by them as a shipwreck from which each single individual man had to swim for his life. These were men who believed that to let oneself drift along passively, accepting the tenets and values of what they knew as society, was purely and simply a disaster. The fact that the emperor was now Christian and that the world was coming to know the cross as a sign of temporal power only strengthened them in their resolve. So we now see emerging in the 4th and 5th century, not just now the distinction between the lay person and the cleric, but now the lay person, the cleric, and increasingly a third class of person, the monk, right? And a kind of triad of 3 states in the life of the church begins to emerge, particularly in the latter centuries of the first millennium. We find literature, for example, that reads some of the biblical parables, like Jesus' parable of the talents in Abba of Fleury around 1000. He reads allegorically Jesus' parable of the talents to suggest that what we're dealing with there are the laity, the clergy, and the monks. And what you've got is good, better, best. Huh? So now what we have is a distinction that's become even more complicated, right? So whereas on the one hand, I'm sorry, yes?
Do these trends work in the East as well as the West?
Well, I'm primarily talking about the West right now, because I think in the East, particularly with monasticism and the unique role of monasticism in the East, the situation gets a little bit more complicated. So for the purposes of simplifying my presentation 1 hour, I'm going to focus on the Western situation. But you're right to note that in the East, particularly the influence of monasticism takes on a very different form. Huh? All right. So where was I? No, that's all right. I just have to, it doesn't take much for me to lose my train of thought, I'm afraid. So what we have is a situation where now the layperson is contrasted to the cleric in terms of church leadership and ministry, and the layperson is contrasted to the monk in terms of holiness. All right? And so we have a twofold contrast that serves to doubly reinforce a sort of secondary status for the layperson, right? Now, cumulatively, when we look at all of these factors developing in different ways and overlapping with one another over the course of the first millennium, we see a gradual hardening of the lay clergy distinction, which only continues in the second millennium. Now, the relationship between the cleric and the monk becomes even more complicated because there's a process of mutual assimilation. So, for example, we have a lot of bishops in the 5th century, people like Augustine of Hippo and Martin of Tours and Paulinus of Nola, who are going to encourage a monastic lifestyle for their clergy. Increasingly, we're going to have monastic communities for whom, even though initially it was a lay movement, the assumption will increasingly be that monks should pursue ordination. And so we have this mutual influence of clergy and monastic life. So that as we get into the 11th and the 12th century, particularly with the collection of legal documents in the life of the church, somebody like Gratian will begin to conflate the role of the monk and the cleric, and will simply declare very famously in his collection of decretals that there are simply two kinds of Christians, clerics and lay people. Now, for the course of the second 1,000 years of Christianity, it would be simplistic to say that distinction simply remains statically in place. First of all, the history of the participation of the laity in the church can never be reduced to simply these theological, legal, and institutional arrangements. To do so would do a tremendous injustice to the creativity of lay people in their popular devotion and piety outside of sort of these larger institutional forms. And to do any kind of justice to the history of the laity over the second millennium would be to talk about the proliferation of lay movements in the 13th and 14th century, the Begards and the Beguines in the 17th century, the attempt to develop a genuine lay spirituality in the writing of somebody like St. Francis de Sales. In the 19th century, the contributions of Cardinal John Henry Newman in emphasizing that the hierarchy might find it worthwhile to consult the laity on matters of significance in the life of the church. But in the midst of a history that is one in which the laity are often remarkable for their creativity in appropriating and owning and practicing their faith, it nevertheless is the case that at sort of a canonical and institutional and even a theological level, we have this hardening distinction between the laity and the clergy. So much so that Pope Pius X could make the following statement in his encyclical at the beginning of the 20th century, and nobody would bat an eye. He would write, "It follows that the church is essentially an unequal society, a societas inequalis. That is, a society comprising two categories of persons, the pastors and the flock, those who occupy a rank in the different degrees of the hierarchy, and the multitude of the faithful. So distinct are these categories that with the pastoral body only rests the necessary right and authority for promoting the end of the society and directing all its members towards that end. And the one duty of the multitude is to allow themselves to be led, and like a docile flock to follow the pastors. We chuckle at it now, but this was simply common understanding in Catholic ecclesiology at the beginning of the 20th century. And yet, the first half of the 20th century sees a great deal of, if you will, pushback against this ecclesiological understanding. And it takes the form of some of the things going on in the liturgical renewal movement, in Catholic action, in the works of theologians like Yves Congar, Karl Rahner, Marie-Dominique Chenu, all of whom are trying to construct a more positive theology of the laity. Yves Congar writes a classic work, Reflections on the Laity in the Church, and in his introduction, and this will be important, we'll come back to this later, he says, it is clear to him that no theological treatment of the laity will be sufficient unless it flows from what he calls a total ecclesiology. That what is required is a comprehensive vision of the whole church, the whole people of God. All right? And he then sets out to do that in his monumental work written a decade before the council would open. All of this brings us to the real central thrust of my presentation today, which is to talk about the Second Vatican Council and its attempt to treat the laity. And one of the things that I want to emphasize, and I increasingly think this is something we have to talk about more when we read the Second Vatican Council, is to celebrate the Council's many contributions, but to also recognize its inevitable limits. Now, the limits, it seems to me, are simply the function of the limits imposed on any council which is trying to respond to the needs of the church at a particular time. So one of the things we have to recognize is, as important as the council was for us, the council did not answer or try to address many of the questions that we find most pressing today. So, for example, one of the questions that immediately comes to the fore when we speak of the laity today is not just the situation of the laity, it's the situation of lay ministry. Right? And I must tell you that the council spent fairly little time thinking about lay ministry in the church. Now, I believe it made some important ecclesiological contributions that opened the door legitimately to the flourishing of lay ministry in the church. But the council itself didn't spend a lot of time on that. More importantly, frequently what Vatican II was doing was effecting a vital and necessary transition in the life of the church, which is to say the council bishops were often a lot clearer about what they felt we needed to move away from than they were about what we needed to move towards. Does that follow? So, for example, where the laity were concerned, there was a widespread conviction, leavened by the experience of Catholic action and the Christian family movement and the works of these theologians that I was talking about, and the liturgical renewal movement, that the council needed to move away from that dichotomous approach to the laity that we found in Via Mentor Nos, and one that attributed very little active participation in the life of the church on the part of the laity. But what we don't find in the council is any real systematic consolidation of established theological principles and insights. We have a halting but real and substantial shift from one paradigm, but a council that was not yet able to synthesize that shift towards a coherent theology that took us in another direction. Hence my argument that what we find in the Vatican II documents are two different attitudes about the laity that stand in a kind of uneasy tension. Now, having said that, I do not in any way want to diminish the momentous contributions the council made regarding the situation of the laity in the life of the church. Even absent an internally coherent theology of the laity, one cannot ignore the significant positive statements the council made in its emphasis, for example, on the right and responsibility that the laity have to be actively involved in the church's apostolate. The council's insistence that the laity are equal sharers in the threefold office of Christ, who is priest, prophet, and shepherd or king. That they are all called to a full, conscious, and active participation in the liturgy. That pastors must acknowledge the expertise, the competency, and the authority of the laity and gratefully accept their counsel. That the council encouraged lay people to engage in advanced biblical and theological studies. And finally, that the council called the laity to take the initiative in the transformation of the temporal order. All of these are tremendous contributions that the council made, and frankly, many of them are elements that still are not yet fully realized in the life of the church today. But even as the council made all of those positive contributions, there was a struggle within the council to develop an adequate theological framework for dealing with the council. And so what I would suggest, and here I'm going to borrow a terminological distinction from an Italian theologian, Giovanni Magnani, I'm going to suggest that what we see in the council are two different trajectories or frameworks for thinking about the role of the laity in the church. The first one, Magnani refers to as a contrastive theology of the laity, or if you prefer, a categorical theology of the laity. This would be a theology of the laity that sees the laity as a discrete category or subset within the life of the church. But it's a category or subset that demands a positive articulation. You know, one of the things that anybody who teaches Catholic ecclesiology, well, not anybody, but many of us do as a sort of thought experiment to get students thinking about both the possibilities and the limits of a theology of the laity, is to invite our students to define the laity without using the word not. Right? And you know, it becomes very difficult to do that because at the end of the day, particularly when we understand the origins of the term, we begin to see that it kind of emerged in the early church out of a negative definition. What are you not? You are not somebody called to ordain ministry or, depending on the framework, profess religious life. All right? So the contrastive theology says we need to come up with a positive theology, one that doesn't focus on the not, one that's not negative, one that speaks something active and positive about the essential role of the laity in the church. And so it's articulated, and I consider this one of the 2 or 3 seminal texts of the council in looking at this. And by the way, I should point out that the Vatican II documents use some cognate form of the word lay, layperson, laicity, about 210 times in the council documents. About 203 of them refer to a layperson or persons. All right? But the dominant and decisive text is found in chapter 4 on the theology in Lumen Gentium. And it's worth our looking at the passage in some detail here. And the italics are mine. The emphasis is mine here. So here we're getting at something that's intending to be a positive description of the laity. To be secular is the special characteristic of the laity. The Latin here is laicis indole secularis. To be secular is the special characteristic of the laity. Although people in holy orders may sometimes be engaged in secular activities or even practice a secular profession, yet by reason of their particular vocation, they are principally and expressly ordained to the sacred ministry, while religious bear outstanding and striking witness that the world cannot be transfigured and offered to God without the spirit of the Beatitudes. It is the special vocation of the laity to seek the kingdom of God by engaging in temporal affairs and directing them according to God's will. They live in the world, in each and every one of the world's occupations and callings, and in the ordinary circumstances of social and family life, which, as it were, form the context of their existence. There, they are called by God to contribute to the sanctification of the world from within, like leaven, in the spirit of the gospel, by fulfilling their own particular duties. I also want to flag that last line there, the use of the metaphor leaven. The metaphor leaven appears in the council document 6 times. 5 of them are in reference to the laity. I'll speak of the 6th in a moment. 5 of them are in reference to the laity. So what we have here is a theological articulation of the laity that succeeds in one respect of getting beyond the dominant view before the council insofar as it's positive. It's not starting with naught. It's starting with something active, that they are called to participate in the sanctification of the world, or Chanut's language, the consecratio mundi, the consecration of the world to Christ, the transformation of the temporal order. All right? This same theology in Lumen Gentium 31 informs the decree on the apostolate of the laity. Here we look at Apostolicum Actuositatem, Articles 2 and 7. The characteristic of the lay state being a life led in the midst of the world and of secular affairs, lay people are called by God to make of their apostolate, through the vigor of their Christian spirit, again, a leaven in the world. Lay people ought themselves to take on, as their distinctive task, this renewal of the temporal order. All right. So here we see text, and by the way, there certainly are other passages that also admit of what I would call a contrastive interpretation of the theology of the laity. Contrastive because we're saying what's distinctive about the laity that applies to them in a way that it does not ordinarily apply to religious or to the ordained. All right? And what's distinctive of their call is their ordination towards the temporal order. All right? They're concerned to participate in the church's mission in the world, if you will. And I'll have more to say about missiology in the council in just a few minutes. Now, since the Second Vatican Council, at the risk of oversimplification, I would suggest to you that this eminently positive theology of the laity has been, in fact, the dominant theology of the laity that's appeared particularly in ecclesiastical documents. So, for example, if you look at Pope John Paul II's apostolic exhortation, Christi Fidelis Laici, I would think what you would see there is a fruitful development, but a development of what I think of as clearly a contrastive theology of the lay vocation. All right? However, there is a school of theological reflection, particularly in the decades since the council, that has begun to ask some questions about this particular stream of thought. And one of the most interesting is that of Cardinal Yves Congar. You recall that Congar, as I suggested, wrote one of the seminal works on the theology of the laity that had a tremendous influence on the bishops at the council. And indeed, he played a very important role in all of the key documents that dealt with the laity in the council. It is largely Congar who introduced to the council the idea that the threefold offices of Christ, the Tria Munera, apply not just to those who are ordained, but to all the baptized. And that architectonic structure of the 3 offices of Christ, priest, prophet, and king is shot through all of the council documents. All right? But Congar, interestingly, in the preface to the 3rd edition of his book on the laity, which was written after the council, reflected back on his earlier preface in which he said the only adequate theology of the laity is one that proceeds from a total ecclesiology. And Congar argued, I now believe I didn't write that theology. All right? I was trying to, I was working towards it, but at the end of the day, I was still too fixated on the lay clergy binary. And as long as I remained fixated on the lay clergy binary, I was not going to get to the total ecclesiology that was the only adequate framework for starting this kind of theological investigation. It's important to recognize that Congar had, in many of his historical studies on ecclesiology, had suggested that modern Catholic ecclesiology was still haunted by a kind of hierarchological view of the church that it inherited from the late Middle Ages, one that saw the church largely as a pyramidal structure. I sometimes speak of it as spiritual Reaganomics, where all truth and power all starts at the top and then trickles down to the base of the church. And whenever Congar wanted to criticize that schema, he would speak of a hierarchology. Well, it's interesting that Edward Schillebeeckx, the Flemish theologian, when he was addressing both the contributions of the council but also some of the limits of the council, he invoked Congar's language of hierarchology. And he makes this statement, largely that for all of the contributions of the council, there are a number of texts that he says are still largely built on hierarchological premises. Here, he writes, it was often forgotten that the positive content of a theology of the laity is already provided by the Christian content of the word Christi Fidelis, Christian faithful. The characteristic feature of the laity began to be explained as their relation to the world. He's talking about the contrastive view. While the characteristic of the clergy was their relationship to the church. And here both sides fail to do justice to the ecclesial dimension of any Christi Fidelis and his or her relationship to the world. The clergy become the apolitical men of the church. The laity are the less ecclesially committed, politically involved men of the world. In this view, the ontological status of the new humanity, reborn with the baptism of the Spirit, was not recognized in his or her own individual worth, but only from the standpoint of the status of the clergy. Now, I'd like to unpack that last claim, because Paul Lakeland makes a similar observation where he says, perhaps the larger problem here is that we continue to think the most significant example of ontological change in the church comes at holy orders, when what we should be focusing on is the preeminent ontological change that occurs at baptism. That baptism is the primary ontological change, the fundamental new creation, when people are baptized into the body of Christ that establishes their deepest personal identity. So Schillebeeckx wants in no way to diminish the contributions of the council, but he's suggesting in a way like Congar that we haven't gone far enough. That we've made a number of positive statements about the laity, but our larger ecclesiological framework still suffers. What is needed is a different lens for thinking about the role of the laity. And here again, I'm going to borrow Magnani's distinction and suggest what is needed is an intensive theology of the laity rather than a contrastive theology. Magnani suggests that while it's possible to arrive at the contrastive view, particularly if one takes a few of these texts and simply reads them independently, if you look at the larger thrust of ecclesiological development over the course of the council, a different framework for thinking about these texts begins to emerge. Now, again, for many of you, what I'm going to talk about is old news, and it'll mostly make you feel good that you already learned all of this stuff. But I want to review it anyway, because what he's suggesting is that you have to read these particular texts on the laity in the context of larger ecclesiological developments. The first is the famous move that was made in the history of Lumen Gentium. Again, this is a move with which many of you are familiar, but it bears emphasizing again because of its significance for our understanding of the laity. Remember, Lumen Gentium is the dogmatic constitution on the church. And when the council bishops received the preliminary draft of this document, which was simply then called De Ecclesia, it had 11 chapters. It was an altogether unsatisfactory document. The title of the first chapter gives you a good sense of the flavor of the entire document. The title of chapter 1 is The Nature of the Church Militant. And it continues largely in that line. One of the Belgian bishops at the council gives a decisive intervention in which he criticizes this schema for being clericalist, juridicist, and triumphalist. And fortunately, the document is sent back to committee. It's thoroughly reworked, and it appears as a new draft, the second draft, which, by the way, the bishops will never see. This is done during the intersession between the first and second session. And in the new draft, we see a significant improvement in the theology and in the architectonic structure of the document. And so the second schema of the De Ecclesia now appears, note the change in the first title, no longer the nature of the church militant, now it is the mystery of the church. And that is followed by chapter 2 on the hierarchy, chapter 3 on the people of God and especially the laity, and chapter 4 on what had once been the states of evangelical perfection was now rewritten as the universal call to holiness. All right? Now, this schema never reaches the bishops. It goes to the Central Commission in between sessions, and there, famously, Cardinal Sunens, though, in fact, more recent historical research is suggesting he may not have been the first person to make the proposal, but he gets credit for it anyway. Cardinal Sunens applauded the document for its considerable advances over the very problematic preparatory schema, the much more rich biblical and theological and sacramental foundations for dealing with the church, the muted triumphalism and juridicism. But he looks at chapter 3, and he proposes that chapter 3 be divided, and that the ample prep material at the beginning of chapter 3 on the church as the people of God, and a reflection on baptism and the threefold office of Christ that all are drawn into through baptism, all of that material, he suggests, should be taken out of that chapter. And what should be left is the material that deals with the laity proper. Material, by the way, that was carried forward from the preparatory schema. That was the one chapter in that 11-chapter preparatory schema that was actually pretty solid theologically. And so what he proposes is a new formulation in which we again have chapter 1 in the mystery of the church, but now the material on people of God is placed in chapter 2, before the chapter on the hierarchy. All right? And then we go chapter 3 on hierarchy, 4 on the laity, 5 on the universal call to holiness, and 3 more chapters will be added. The material and religious life will be pared out of chapter baptism. This is what happens when you put the slide together at the last minute. That's chapter 5 on the universal call to holiness. Chapter 6 will be on consecrated religious life, chapter 7 on the pilgrim church, chapter 8 on Mary. What is significant here, of course, and this is part of Magnani's point, is not the denial of a distinctive place for the laity in the church, but framing, prior to a discussion of hierarchy and laity, a more comprehensive theology of the church based on baptism. Right? And it's, of course, in this chapter on the people of God, as again, we get the threefold offices of Christ played out as it applies to the baptized. It's here that we get in Lumen Gentium 10 that important attribution that Tom Groom talked about, that in the one priesthood of Christ, you have both the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood of all believers that are both grounded in the one priesthood of Christ. There's a way in which what Sunens was calling the council to was an intuition that still was operative for at least the first half of the first millennium. That is to say, a recognition that while some are called to ordered ministry in the church, a more primary call is the call to baptism and discipleship. And so many people are familiar with the passage from Augustine's Sermon 340. When I am frightened by who I am for you, then I am consoled by who I am with you. Because for you I am a bishop, but with you I am a Christian. The first is my obligation. The second is grace. The first is fraught with danger, but in the second lies my salvation. This was a recognition that there is a distinction in the church for those called to ordain leadership, but our primary identity is based on baptism. All right? Our primary identity is based on baptism. A number of theologians in the decades after the council, particularly in Italy, tried to develop this particular approach to the laity, largely by suggesting that if we're going to use the word lay, and by lay mean orientation to the temporal order, orientation to the larger world, then the most appropriate use of the word lay is to predicate not some category among the people of God, but to predicate the church itself. So the Italian theologian Bruno Forte, in his little book, The Church, Icon of the Trinity, which he wrote in the early 1990s. He's now an Archbishop of the Church today, and I must be honest, you don't see much of this anymore in his writing. But in that book, Forte suggested that if you look at what the council was suggesting, particularly in Gaudium et Spes, it was struggling to articulate a vision of the laicity of the whole church. And if you don't mind, again, I want to give you a text from that book because it articulates, I think, the heart of this shift in context for thinking about the laity. He writes, the relationship with temporal realities is proper to all the baptized, though in a variety of forms, joined more to personal charisms than to static contrasts between laity, hierarchy, and religious state. No one is neutral toward the historical circumstances in which he or she is living. And an alleged neutrality can easily become a voluntary or involuntary mask for ideologies and special interests. It is the entire community that has to confront the secular world, being marked by that world in its being and in its action. The entire people of God must be characterized by a positive relationship with the secular dimension. All right? So he goes on to write, there is one sphere of existence with a complexity of definite relations that make up history. His argument is, and here what I want to point out is Forte is drawing on a way of reading the council through the lens of Christian mission. You know, there are a lot of ecclesiologists that think the most mature ecclesiological document at Vatican II was Ad Gentis, the decree on the missionary life of the church. That wonderful document that spoke of how the church is missionary by its very nature. All right? That the church exists not for its own sake. The most important thing about the church is not the church's existence. It is the church's mission in the world. And if that's the case, then nobody in the church is neutral towards the world. All of us, in our own proper way, in the distinctiveness of our relations and our charisms and our communal commitments, all of us are called to be oriented toward, to participate in the church's mission in the world. So from this point of view, he's arguing the whole church is in some sense lay. Now, Magnani goes on to suggest that he thinks it's quite possible that many of the bishops, in fact, were trying to struggle towards this theology of the laity, one that he's calling an intensive theology. And he cites in support of his view the well-known relatio of Cardinal Wright. Whenever the Theological Commission, you know, these documents go through all sorts of revisions over the course of the 4 sessions of the council. And whenever a new draft is presented to the council bishops, there's a relator, somebody who was on the drafting committee, who gives an orienting speech that explains, here's the new text, these are the changes, some of you called for these changes, here's why we're doing those, here's why we're not doing those, and so on. And he explains the rationale of it. Well, Cardinal Wright gives a very important relatio on this, in which he says, it was not the commission's intention. Now, he's referring to Lumen Gentium 31. It was not the commission's intention to offer an ontological definition of the laity, but only a typological description of the laity. In other words, we're saying, here's sort of the laity is the typical example of Christian involvement in the world. All right? Now, I think that distinction that Cardinal Wright makes is very significant because I do believe there's a strand in the church today that wants to turn the secular character of the laity into an almost ontological category. All right? And Magnani's argument is, I don't think that's what the council was doing at all. The council was struggling to say, here's what all the baptized are called to. And look at the typical layperson, because there you will see the most intensive realization of what all Christians are called to do, which is to engage in the world. And does everybody see what I'm saying? So the intensive view is to say, we'll continue, there's a value in talking about the laity, because they become the most intensive embodiment of what the whole church is to be concerned with. All right? So it resists a categorical or a contrastive view that's trying to say, lay people, you're the foot soldiers out in the world. Clergy, you're over here in the sacred preserve, and you'll stay at headquarters and send the people out with orders. All right? So they're trying to avoid an infantry model of the laity in service of the church's mission in the world. It's interesting, by the way, that when the bishops were debating Presbyterorum Ordinis, the decree on priestly ministry and life, Archbishop Franjo Sepper, there's a certain irony that it would be Archbishop Sepper, he would later be prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, he makes a very interesting intervention in which he says, when we talk to priests about the unique sacramental character conferred by holy orders, we should be careful to remind them that it does not erase the sacramental character conferred through baptism and confirmation. Now, it's a very important observation. He's saying you don't become such a different class of Christian that the basic obligations of baptism and confirmation no longer apply. You are first and foremost a baptized and confirmed Christian with all of the obligations that baptism, discipleship, and mission entails. And then you are ordained to a particular ecclesial relationship in service of the church and its mission. But that doesn't erase your baptismal obligations. You see, the contrastive view tends to want to say, clergy, you have one set of obligations. Laity, you have another. Now, we want to assure you, laity, that your obligations are just as important. But the contrastive view wants to dramatically distinguish them. The intensive view wants to say, no, the laity are living out in a more dramatic way because of their concerns with career and citizenship and marriage and family. They may be more fully immersed in the world, but it's not like that gives permission to the clergy or professed religious to somehow be aloof or removed from the world. Now, the final point that I would bring up here, this is the typological rather than ontological distinction. The final contribution here, I think, to why it should be clear I prefer a more intensive rather than contrastive view of the laity, is a contribution made by the theologian Jan Gutierrez. Gutierrez has noted that over the course of the council, there were a number of shifts that took place that you can see as the documents developed over the council. And one of them is, he suggests, that when the council was dealing with the laity in particular, in Lumen Gentium 31, in the Decree in the Apostle of the Laity, the framework tended to be sacred secular or sacred temporal. But as the council went on, he suggests, we begin to see a subtle shift. Now, it's an uneven shift. It's not a systematic shift. But he argues it's no longer sacred secular. It's now historical eschatological. And that's very different. He says it's particularly pronounced in Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes only, that's the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, only uses the word lay, or a cognate version of it, 6 times. But the first time doesn't appear until Article 43. And more significantly, remember I told you the metaphor 11 appears in earlier documents 5 times, and it's applied to the laity. The 6th appearance of the metaphor 11 appears in Gaudium et Spes. But there in Article 40, it's applied to the whole church. In Article 40, Gaudium et Spes says it's the whole church that is in mission in the world, that is to be a leaven in society. That all of the church is oriented towards the world. The whole church lives in history, but yearns for the coming of God's kingdom, is a pilgrim church, hence the eschatological, right? So the primary relation is not sacred temporal, but secular eschatological or historical eschatological, all right? The difficulty is the council only begins to make this shift in its decree on the missionary activity of the church and in the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, all right? Now, What I've tried to suggest here is that in the council documents, what we see is a tension between two different theological interpretations of the role of the laity. Both are struggling to distance themselves from a preconciliar framework that could not give much positive articulation of the role of the laity in the life of the church. Both, it seems to me, are advances from where the church was at the time of Pius X, for example, in Via Mentor Nos. But one of them seems to be more adequate to a more comprehensive mission-oriented theology of the church that was struggling at the council to give a priority to the sacrament of baptism and insisted that any other distinctions in the life of the church build on rather than erase that theology of baptism. If we think of the vision of the laity from this more intensive point of view, we recognize that we've got to kind of set aside hard, fast distinctions between spheres of ecclesial life, one that's appropriate to the clergy, one that's appropriate to the laity. We need to engage in a more robust theology of mission that thinks of the whole church in mission. And those who are engaged in public ministry of the church are not doing insider stuff, but are in fact forming communities for Christian mission, preaching for the sake of Christian mission, administering sacraments in service of the call to Christian mission. It's a way of recognizing that the priesthood, the ministerial priesthood, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church put it, exists for no other purpose than to serve the enabling and empowerment of the priesthood of all the baptized. All right? So I think I have actually some more material to do here, because one of the things that this, of course, is going to require is that we go back and revisit the theology of ministry. Because, of course, the reason that this hardened distinction between laity and clergy was given such force was that we had that reduction of a plurality of ministries to ministry of the ordained and only the ordained. Consequently, we're not going to be able to break out of this unless not only do we move beyond that secular sacred framework to a theology of mission, but we're also going to need to move beyond a hardened distinction between ordained ministry and all those other ministries that are not ordained to a more comprehensive theology of ministry that I've called in some of my writings ordered ministry in service of an ordered communion. Thank you all very much, and I think I'll stop and invite your own questions and reflections and comments.